All right, welcome to digital video compositing. So the first project, well, what are we looking at? This is a motion graphics project, I would say. And what is motion graphics? I'm sure there's a lot of definitions, but to me it seems like it's basically a lot of flashy, like two-dimensional shapes layered on top of each other to the point where it's sensory overload, and it makes the creator look really cool because the viewer can't like comprehend everything that's going on. It's just it looks like so much is happening, and it looks like you put so much work into it that it makes you kind of look like an expert. But really, if you break it down, there's just about 4 things going on in this. And for the first maybe class or two, we're going to try to build up to something that looks kind of like this. So if we break it down, I'm just going to pause this animation. We just have kind of like a background shift between red to yellow. And then we have these kind of circular explosions, right, that just kind of grow out. They're like shock waves. And then we have these more like firework explosions that pop, pop, pop. And then lastly, when the background changes, it's accented by these streaks. So it's 4 things, but when you watch it, it's just like so much to take in. But really, it's you make those 4 elements and then you duplicate them, and you end up with these little explosions or these little fireworks are made up of 2 elements duplicated. So you end up with a lot going on. So let's do File, New Project, and I'm sure these like panels have names. We'll just kind of make names up as we go because I actually don't quite know what these names are. Like in Premiere, this might be called the timeline, and this might be called your media viewer or something. And this is kind of like your preview window. But basically right here is where like our compositions or video files would go, or pictures. You could drag music, video files into this part, and that's where it will stay. If you had, in After Effects, we don't use sequences, we use compositions. And to create one, you can click this button here, and we'll just call this Flashy Overload. And by default, it should be 1920 by 1080 and frame rate 29.97. I'm going to do 23.976, but that's the film frame rate. This one is more like television, which this work is most likely would get on television, so you probably should keep it to that. So anyways, we have this this composition here, and it says the frame rate. I could right click on it and do composition settings and switch it back to 29.97 if I wanted. The duration, I think default is 15, but let's set it to 10 if it's not. It doesn't really need to be 10. And down here in the timeline, we have 0 through 10 seconds. What else to look at? So up here are tools. Normally you want to be using this like arrow selection tool to click and drag things. If you ever want to rotate them, you can click this tool to click and drag and rotate. This tool is where its anchor point is. We'll get into that later. This creates shapes or masks. This types text. This pen tool creates curves. So we'll get into all this later, but up here is where like our tools reside. Over here is mainly we'll just use this to find effects to add to our layers. So let's just kind of jump in, and we'll all learn as we go. So first we want to create a background. By default, or when there's no background, it looks like you have a black screen, but really it's a transparent. There's nothing there, and you can see what's transparent or not by doing this little toggle. So there's nothing here, and I want to create a solid background color. And there's many ways to do that, but I'm just going to go up to Layer and say New Solid, and I'm just going to say BG for background, and we'll just hit OK. It can be this yellow. And we want to try to keep our layers named as we create them. If I ever want to change that name, I can click it and hit Enter or Return and type in like awesome background. So that's how we name layers, just as you create them. Try to name them, because we do a lot of duplicating, and now if I duplicate that layer, it will, you know, name it awesome background 2. So that's pretty awesome. If I want to change the properties of this, I can go into layer, solid settings, and there's always these like keyboard shortcuts. And just a heads up, we use a lot of shortcuts in this class. Because I feel it makes working in these programs much quicker and more intuitive, and it will make you, in the end, a better motion graphics artist, or better artist in general. You know, it's like you don't have to, you don't always have to make your green paint by mixing yellow and blue. So I'm gonna, anyways, I want to change this color. So click that, go layer, solid settings. I could do Control-Shift-Y. And they are often intuitive, because to create a new solid, it would be Control or Command-Y if you're on a Mac. And then solid settings would be Command-Shift-Y. So they try to keep them intuitive. But I'll do this like red color, more orange. You can check off your layers by these little eyeballs, just like in Photoshop. And I'll leave this yellow layer on, and I'm just going to drag this layer, awesome background 2, to the bottom. So this first video, I'm just going to show you how to make the circular shockwave. And basically this is going to be done using masks. And I want to show you just briefly the different blending modes of a mask. So instead of making another solid, which I could to make a color, I'm going to make a shape. And if I click this little rectangle, you can choose the fill color. If there is a stroke on yours, I think by default it might be set, it might look something like this, and this allows you to change the color of the stroke, but we don't need a stroke. So click the word stroke and click this little slash, red slash, to set it to no stroke. And let's change this color of the fill to be, and you can change it all later once you make it. But let's say I'm just clicking and dragging, and now I'm going to hold space bar while I'm dragging to like move it into position. So we have this shape, and it's called shape layer 1. I'm just going to hit return and call this test. Now, if I want to make a mask, I could use the pen tool. I'm going to make a circular mask though, so I'm going to click and hold on this and say ellipse tool. And since I have nothing selected here, if I were to click and drag, it would actually just make a new shape layer. So I'm going to click this test. I still have that tool selected, and it would actually still make another shape layer just within this shape layer. So the contents are now an ellipse and a rectangle. I don't want another shape. So I have to change the tool to be, instead of creating a shape, as you can see, it says tool creates mask. And you can see this kind of like transparent background in a shape. So now I have this shape hiding. It's basically being cut up by this ellipse. And the blending mode of this mask 1 is set to add. And notice there's like a brown color and a brown outline. So if you click that color, you can set that to, you know, whatever color you want. When you have a lot of masks, sometimes the colors help you see what you're looking at. So add just means that whatever is within this mask, it will reveal. If I have it set to subtract, whatever's within the mask, it will subtract. Now these other ones don't really do much unless you have multiple masks. So I'm going to set this to intersect, and I'm going to duplicate it, and they're sitting on top of each other right now. So click this tool up here, the selection tool, or just hit V, which is the same shortcut in Premiere. Your little arrow tool is V. And I'm going to double click on the line between the 2 points, which kind of shows me a bounding box of this mask, and I'm just going to drag it to the side. So now I have 2 masks. Let me change the color of this one. Usually it will create new colors for you unless you like duplicate it. But now it's only revealing where the masks intersect, and if you set this to difference, it's interesting, I'm still learning this too, so you know, sometimes you get the same result if one is set to add and then the next mask in line is set to difference. But if you change the order of the masks, it does make a difference. Or if you invert it. So you just got to play with these sometimes to get the results you want. But what we're going to do is I want the first mask set to add. I mean, just watch for a second longer. And the second mask set to subtract. And let me double click the line to get the bounding box. If you just think if you just like click on points, yeah, sometimes well, anyways, double click on it to get it. And if we were to like scale it in, we get this kind of outline effect where it looks like there's the outline. So we want to use that to our advantage. We want to have a mask that's adding and then a mask that's cutting into it to get that kind of, that's what's going to create our shock wave. So let's go up to this shape tool or mask tool, and since I have nothing selected, it's going to be a shape tool. I'm going to set it to ellipse. I can do that by just hitting Q to toggle through. So here's an ellipse. I'm going to hold shift while I'm dragging so it's a perfect circle. And you saw before I could have that tool selected and hit create mask, and I could just drag out a mask and try to line it up perfectly. But for me, I want this mask to be perfectly around that shape I created. So a shortcut is if you have this shape layer, which we'll call circle, and if I hit Control-Shift-N, it will create a new mask that's perfectly centered. It perfectly covers all the pixels of that circle, but it's a square when it comes in. So I'm going to open this mask properties, click shape, and set it to, well, reset it to ellipse. So sometimes it might say rectangle and just say reset to ellipse and make sure this is checked and hit OK. So now my mask and my shape, they're perfectly the same size. And within this, within the properties of the mask, there's this option called mask expansion. So I can make it look like the circle is growing and shrinking by changing the expansion of the mask. So let's animate this. It was at 0, and let's go to frame about 1 second, and it doesn't matter really. But click this stopwatch, and it creates a keyframe at that point. And now if I hit page up to go back a few frames, I'm going to go back 10. Or if you hold shift and hit page up, it jumps 10 frames. And I'm going to create another keyframe automatically. It just will automatically create it now that we started the stopwatch just by dragging. Just drag that number down so it disappears. So now we have this growing circle. And you could have made that just by scaling the original circle we made, but because we want to make that cut into it, we need to use masks. So I'm going to duplicate this mask. And now here's the duplicated mask. I can see there's keyframed properties, but I can't see the actual keyframes until I jump in there by opening that little caret, I guess. And right now nothing's happening, but if I set this new mask to subtract, we kind of lose, we don't see anything because what's going on is one mask is adding at the exact same speed as the new mask is subtracting. So if I click and drag, select these keyframes and drag them out a little bit, now we have a mask adding and another mask subtracting at different times. So now we have kind of a shockwave effect, but it's lacking personality, and mainly that's because the interpolation speed. If we were to drag these out, drag out these second ones a bit, really what's going on is the speed, like an explosion, has acceleration and deceleration, resistance, we could say. Right now, these are just linear. It's just like it starts and stops at the same speed the whole time. So a quick way to like automatically change the interpolation speed is if I just select and drag all those. On your computer, you can hit F9. F9 on mine will right now pause the recording, so I can't do that. But with those keyframes selected, it's often useful to right-click on them and go to the same effect as keyframe assist. This is just a useful thing. We'll use this a lot in the future, right-clicking on keyframes. But you just hit F9. I have to manually right-click, go to Easy Ease, and as you can see, there's the shortcut F9. And what this does is it starts at a speed of 0 and accelerates into its change and then decelerates out of its change. So it gives it some more dynamic. Let's just see what it looked like before. So there's the before, and then Easy Ease. Here's the after. It's subtle, but I do think it has more personality this way. Okay, so we have this nice little explosion, and that's pretty much the basics of this explosion, but let's take this just a few steps further. So the nice thing about using masks is the curve of the mask. We can scale this shape and move it around and it won't lose resolution. So here's where you can start getting like to make your stuff look more detailed. I'm going to just select this circle layer, Control D to duplicate it. I could have just right clicked and or click maybe layer. I mean, you can usually find these within these menus up here, like there's duplicate. But now I have two doing the same thing, so I'm going to select the top one and then hit V to go to my mouse tool and just like move it over. And now we have two doing different ones. And I could change the color by clicking this layer and maybe making this one white. Clicking the layer, and then if you click the fill color. So now we have two doing that. Okay, so maybe I want to scale it. So if I have this layer selected, you could pop into the transform properties or just hit S, and it kind of like cleans it up. So you're only looking at the scale property. So now we have kind of two, but the main problem is they're going in tandem. They're the same speed. So all you have to do is just click and drag this layer and offset it a little bit to get that personality. So now let's duplicate this one more time, and maybe this one will start a little sooner, and I'll drag it this way. Or maybe it should go behind the original circle. And maybe it should start before, kind of like it causes the explosion. You know, I don't really like how it goes in a line, so maybe move this here. So this is just where like kind of the art and the play come into play. You know, that looks better to me, just pop, pop, pop. One other thing you could do, so this original circle, you know, it just has this like one band. If you wanted to make it seem more complex, you could do that really easily without doing anything that complex. So I'm going to duplicate it and put this at the top, and let's just solo this layer by clicking this solo button. You don't have to, I just want you to see cleanly what's going on. If I hit M to bring up all my masks, I can see these two masks, but I want to see the keyframes, like where the keyframes are. So let me just hit U to open up keyframed properties. There's only masks in this layer, so there's only masks with keyframe properties, so the masks pop up and I see their keyframes. I'm going to hit Shift and select both of the masks, or maybe you could click and drag. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate them, and now they're kind of like spaced out, overlapping. But if with both of them selected, I'm just going to click and drag them down. So now it's mask 1, 2, 3, and 4. And their keyframes are hiding again within here. And with both of them selected, you could just... We like to save space, so that's why this U shortcut is really useful. So I'm going to hit U to close everything, and then U to open up the new keyframes. And I just want to offset the new set of masks slightly. So now I have... it's basically like one mask is drawing on, the other is subtracting, and then another mask is drawing on, and then another mask is subtracting. I just noticed, though, something to keep in mind is you might not be able to see it on this recording, but there is, since one mask since the mask was just duplicated, let's go back to the original one. I'm just gonna unsolo this and hide it for a second. So the original circle has this same problem, and I should have cleaned it up. But when this mask subtracts, it should subtract to a little bit farther than that original that mask one. See, right now they're both at 0 pixels. So if I drag this to subtract out to like 15 pixels, it will get rid of that. You know, we still had like a little bit of an outline left, so you could just say 1 pixel and it should be enough to get rid of it. So that's a little unfortunate because then you did all that duplicating, but really it's no big deal. It's little things like that though that we should watch out for. Really, I could just go into these quite quickly. If I hit this keyframe to change, if I start changing the keyframe here, it'll automatically create a new keyframe. I'm going to hit K to jump to the next keyframe and just set this to 1. And this was the other problem. Hit U to open my keyframe properties. I'm going to hit J, so J and K jump back and forth between keyframes. Select this keyframe and hit 1 just to make sure that they fully disappear. And then this one, lastly, just make sure the mask expands to 1. And this one expands to 1. So now we have this going on. And let's see, let's move this over here. And let's change the color. So anyways, this was just the first video on how do you make the shockwave. So in the next video we'll do, well, wait and find out. We'll see.